now like to introduce one of my colleagues. He's actually the guy who showed me around the studios when I first joined Deutsche Welle, Mr. Christopher Springate. He has the very difficult task of answering the question, how much inequality does a society need? And if that's difficult, then we'll have a grand old time after that, because it will be time for the boat cruise. But first, let's dig into the serious stuff.
Good afternoon from me as well. My name is Christopher Springate. I work for DW News as a news anchor and reporter. And actually, you know, I don't have that tough task to answer that difficult question, because I have some wonderful panelists. I will introduce you to those panelists in just a second. But first of all, I just want to welcome you to the GMF's Economic Policy Panel. Let me just read out that title for you one more time. How much inequality does a society need? How much inequality can a society tolerate if it wants to develop sustainably?
Global inequalities, the central theme at this year's Deutsche Welle Global Media Forum. Privilege and poverty, prosperity and squalor. They exist side by side, even in the wealthiest nations. Across the globe, governments reduce taxes for the rich in order to push investment and growth. But do these economics really work? Inequality seems to be growing everywhere, undermining political stability and tearing at the social fabric. Join our discussion. How much inequality does a society need, and how much can it tolerate to develop sustainably? Here at the Global Media Forum 2018.
So, a tough question indeed, Edith, you're absolutely right about that. But to help me answer that question, we've organized basically four perspectives for you. We have an academic, journalistic perspective from Linda Yue, who is a prominent Anglo-American economist. Do join us here on the panel, Linda. Professor of economics at Oxford University, at the London Business School, also a fellow broadcaster. She used to be the economics correspondent for BBC, for Bloomberg TV. Her latest book, The Great Economists, by all means, how their ideas can help us today. We can give a round of applause at the end when I've got everybody. Otherwise, we won't get going. So that's the academic journalistic perspective from Linda. We also have a grassroots human rights perspective from a man that I'm sure many of you know, Colin Gonsalves, from India. He's the founder of the Human Rights Law Network in India, and probably better known to you as the winner of the Right Livelihood Award. Colin, nice to have you with us. Could you sit over there? I'm going to take a seat on the side. And, you know, that's the Alternative Nobel Prize. And he was awarded it essentially for his life of service in defense of people in his country who are not able to defend themselves. So it's great to have you with us, Colin. We have the perspective of a development economist, Mario Negre from the German Development Institute. Come and join us, Mario. He's a senior researcher at the German Development Institute. A long career taking him initially from Barcelona, also to India, so we have some common talking points, Colin, to the World Bank. His perspective is also as a specialist for pro-poor growth, for inclusiveness, and for the measurement of inequality, though Lucas has just told us that we want to move from measurement to action, so we'll be talking about that. Last but not least, the perspective of Germany's Employers Association, Peter Clever. Does that mean you're a very clever man, Peter?
I should tell you the name of my wife. Her name is Birgit Overclever, so...
Aha. Okay. I'd like to meet your wife at some point, Peter. Anyway, Peter has held many senior positions at Germany's Labour Ministry, He's now a member of the executive at the German Employers Association. I should also mention he is the chairman of Deutsche Welle's board of directors. He's held that post for 10 years. Now is the time to applaud. Now, you all have your microphones. Oh, I just want to point out that over there we have our social media desk. So Yakov and Michaela, who are monitoring our Twitter feed, they're monitoring the Twitter wall using the app. So if you have questions and you fail to get my attention, then just tweet or put something on the Twitter wall. Yakov will be trying to get my attention. That's one great way of putting in a contribution, an opinion, or a question, and we would like you to join in because this is such an important debate. Yakov, do you just want to tell us a little bit about the activity we've had so far today?
Yes, we've been quite popular, and when I say we, it means, of course, the Global Media Forum as official hashtag DW_GMF. Was trending a whole day, so reaching second place. We're kind of losing a battle against Cebit, but you're more than welcome to tweet, share your comments, posts. You already do, but it would be nice to continue this trend. So if you have any questions, as Christopher already said, just use the hashtag DW_GMF, and thanks for all the posts and nice comments you already shared.
And I will be trying to reserve some time at the end of the panel for your questions. Bear in mind, by the way, that the reward for being focused in this panel is a wonderful boat ride starting at 6:30 p.m. So, but you're all very focused, I can see that, and so many of you here. Thank you for coming. I want to start off with what I feel is a key question. Perhaps we can start with you, Linda. We've just had Lucas Chancel showing us, the extent of economic inequality, wealth and income inequality over, since 1980. My question is very simple. Has income inequality, has wealth inequality on the global scale reached dangerous proportions?
I think given the amount of unhappiness, the level of inequality, I would say certainly at a crisis level in terms of social perception. And that's really all that matters in a society, is how much people accept inequality. So the first thing to say, of course, is that he showed us a fantastic set of data trends going over decades. Lots of things have changed in the world. There's one thing I do want to point out. Of course, you can't cover everything in a short and very good presentation, by the way. Globally, income inequality has actually come down because emerging economies are catching up with developed countries. But within countries, as you rightly said, and if you look at emerging economies, inequality has risen within countries. And that's why what I mean when I say socially, societal perception-wise, inequality has gotten very high. Now, what I think some countries are obviously standouts. I think America, we saw from the data, is entering a second Gilded Age. In other words, inequality today is higher, if not as probably higher. It's difficult to measure when you're thinking back to the late 19th century as the kind of the roaring 20s, the age that the Great Gatsby and others were writing about. And I think that inequality is a proxy for other problems in the economy, including median wages being stagnant for 40 years. And that's a real issue that I think we've seen really pop up in elections. But let me go to the other side, which is China. Communist China today is as unequal as capitalist America on some of these measures of inequality. So I think, again, within a country, these are levels which I think warrants quite a lot of discussion, even though we should acknowledge how much growth has happened around the world. And certainly in terms of reducing poverty, we've seen great catch-up from developing countries.
So that, in a sense, is the good news, that on a global scale, between countries, the formerly poor nations, especially Southeast Asia, the Asian tigers, and China, have caught up with the rich world. But what we're talking about is income inequality, wealth inequality within countries.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know that that's something that Colin thinks strongly about. So, Colin, how dangerous is that kind of income inequality? We saw that India, on Lucas's chart, had a very high rise in inequality. So, give us an Indian perspective on how dangerous that kind of inequality is.
Right. Inequality in India, and I think inequality in the world, has been alarmingly high for decades. As far as the developing world is concerned, it seemed to be under some level of control up to the late 80s, when we had a social democratic system which tried to take all citizens along, rich and poor alike. And you couldn't ever have absolute equality, I suppose, but the nation state and the governments tried to take everybody along. So social democracy, where there was some kind of a notion that you must take people, whether they're from the working class or whatever, the middle class, they must be taken together. But that level of inequality began to rise very steeply. And somehow when we talk about equality rising, we assume that the government is very upset by inequality rising. Not at all. In fact, it is the structure of capitalism itself, it is the structure of globalization, which builds its profits and super profits, particularly specifically on inequality deepening. So a government like the government of India would not be alarmed at all by high levels of inequality, because your GDP of 7% today, and India is a world economic tiger, is based precisely on keeping a large section of the population down, by depriving them of the social benefits that they would normally get under social democracy, introducing a trickle-up system where you take away from the poor what they got under social democracy, you take away funding for housing, for food, for education, for health services, and you cause it to trickle up to a small 250 million people, middle class and upper middle class, which gets all the benefits that otherwise went to the poor. So you have huge growth in GDP. GDP is seen as the measure of growth. You see the middle classes as the engines of change. And you're happy, because GDP is what the whole world is looking at. But the country knows, and the government knows, and our prime ministers know, that 75% of the population, or let's say 750 million people, are simultaneously living below a poverty line of $2 a day. Today in India, 2018, 750 million people below $2 a day. And our Prime Minister is very happy that we have a GDP rate of 7% and 8%. So inequality is an inherent basis of capitalist society today, particularly under globalization, which affects the developing countries in a way in which I think people in the developed world don't understand at all. You'll have a softer and a more benevolent understanding of globalization. But we know what it meant. And it meant just 3 words. Subsidies are bad. Namely, whatever subsidies go to the poor must be dismantled. The state has no responsibility to look after your education, health, and nutrition, and housing, and so on. The state will give all its resources to the corporate sector, and the corporate sector will make factories, give you jobs, you'll get employment, and you'll get money, and you can buy for all your services. So the abandonment of the poor by the state is globalization, so in our understanding.
Perhaps Perhaps one of the solutions would be one of the best practice examples that Lucas was showing us earlier, an Indonesian solution, a fossil fuel tax in India feeding into the health system.
I'll just take a minute. I don't agree with any of these technological solutions. I don't agree with any of this tinkering with the system. The system is politically evil, and it requires drastic political movements to change the political system completely. Now, you may think it's very, very sort of idealistic, very Che Guevara kind of stuff, that is not applicable in the modern world. But if you look around you and see the levels of anger, you see the levels of movement, you see the levels of insurrection, you see the wars that are taking place around us in Asia, let alone the wars in Iraq and so on, you realize that this tinkering or these technological solutions are totally bogus solutions. You need fundamental political change, which means you must change the nature of capitalism itself.
Let me bring in Peter Clever on this, but let me start off by just reading you a quick quote from former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, which I think you would probably agree with, Colin. He wrote this past May, "There is a growing consensus that the current economic model is not fit for purpose." Peter, what would you say to that?
What does it mean, the current political model?
Economic model.
Economic model. Mm-hmm. We have a model here in Germany, and I would say in Europe, where we have free market economy, but socially balanced. And look to the figures here in our country. I can't see a tendency for inequality which is not tolerable. I see it worldwide. All examples we have seen on the screen there. Nobody should tolerate this kinds of inequality. It's a question of the dimension and the question whether there is a lasting inequality. You see, every kind of progress goes parallel with rising inequality. If someone has a good idea and realize it and has economic success, inequality is rising automatically. But what we have to really observe very closely is there a systematic and a lasting and growing inequality? Then we have really to do politics which counter those tendencies. And our first answer, and I can really look back to nearly 40 years of professional life, the balance between powers of trade unions and independent trade unions and independent employers associations is really a tool where we can socially balance our society. And this is what we try in Germany, and we will try in future, and we try to disseminate this thinking of economic progress, but accompanied always from the beginning by socially balanced measures.
Okay, so inequality is part and parcel of economic development as long as it's not lasting.
Yes.
Okay. Mario, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I just want to take what Peter was saying there, and also, this idea of strong trade unions. And a social contract between employers and trade unions. Is that a path, that German model, the social, you talked about social democracy, is that a path for India?
Well, you see, we're in Germany. And often when we talk about the world, we extrapolate from Germany. And I must say, with all my critical comments about capitalism, I have a grudging admiration for this country.
Why grudging? Why grudging?
Well, let's leave that for the time being. And when we saw Merkel, for example, accepting, refugees into Germany, we understood that there are sides of capitalism which are to be commented upon positively. But it's the biggest mistake, situated in Germany, sitting here in a conference, to think the world is like this, right? Even Europe's not like this. Greece is not like this. Spain is not like this. Italy has such high levels of unemployment which were unimaginable a few years ago. So the German model, we can't answer the critique of capitalism, and we can't answer the fundamental weakening and the breakup of a capitalist system by referring to a German model. We don't know what may happen to Germany. But we know that in parts of Europe today, workers may not get their pensions 4 or 5 years down the line. We know that. They may retire and they may not have anything in the bank to rely on. So what's happening is globalization is catching up with Europe in a way in which it has been in the developing world for a long, long time. We know how unreliable it is. We know how cruel it can be. We know how it suppresses the working class peoples to unimaginable levels of indignity and poverty and destitution. Starvation deaths in a country of 7.7 GDP growth. We know that. Therefore, we must think. We cannot think that Germany is the model for the world. We must understand, we must take ourselves, at least in mind, if not in the body, We must take our minds and go to the lessons of the developing world. And I wish a conference like this was organized in a tribal area in my country, where the language would be different, the questions would be different, the emotions would be very clear, and there would be no ambiguity at all, that no level of inequality is tolerable in any country. We are fed up with that system of inequality.
From 1.8 billion to 800 million. That's an incredible achievement. And then we cannot miss this achievement when we discuss about this topic either, right? And sorry, I just want to pick you up on that study you talked about that you did for the World Bank. Just explain to us again the countries, the low-income countries, middle-income countries who are making progress. What exactly were they doing?
Well, it was a combination of things, yeah? So there's no single measure. So one very big factor is that is high commodity prices. So many of these countries that were producing commodities like primary goods and so on, they did well. Many of the small producers in several of these lands did well, comparing to other parts of the income distribution, and therefore inequality was reduced. In many cases, there were very clear policies like Brazil, Mexico, with tax transfers that were more progressive, with cash transfers, early childhood development, which we know is, these are policies that we know they work. We know best that they work in reducing inequality and not only not harming growth and incentives, but actually boosting growth as well. Yeah? The problem here, and I think it's very much a media issue as well, in developed countries is where inequality is rising much more, by any measure, yeah, of inequality. And therefore, we extrapolate and we say that everywhere, inequality is growing. Now, the top incomes are growing everywhere, their share. But inequality as measured with some central Gini measures or so, in some places it's being decreased. So there is some progress as well.
Okay, Linda, I have a feeling you want to make a comment at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to pick up on a few of the themes, I think the first thing to say, and I looked at this issue actually in my book that you mentioned. I asked the question, is inequality inevitable? And as Peter said, it is. As economies develop, income inequality rises because some people are always better off when the economy industrializes or if an economy moves into the services sector. So people who do tech, for instance, win and manufacturing workers lose. But how much inequality you tolerate is a political decision, which goes back to the social forces that we describe. So if you look around the world, there are instances of governments, not just in Germany, that have taken redistributive policies. These are mainly either redistributing actual assets like land or through the taxation and transfer system to reduce or keep income inequality at a socially acceptable level. So what we've seen is that in developed countries, there's very clearly a difference between the United States and Europe, Scandinavian, Nordic countries versus the United States. This is going to sound like I'm singling out the United States, and I kind of am. But that kind of choice you also see in other developing countries or countries that have become rich. So East Asia, so this is South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they are known for having grown equitably, as in because they were very big on redistribution at the start of development, which meant that they were models for fast growth. They are among the very few countries, they're among the 13 countries that have become rich since 1960. So it is very possible. There were 160 middle-income countries in 1960. Only 13 became rich by 2008. Within them are these East Asian countries that have grown rich and are more equal than other countries that have remained middle income. So there's no correlation between inequality and the ability to grow.
And how did they do that?
Well, redistribution. So specifically in Taiwan, there was land redistribution. You also saw that in terms of what we economists call pre-distribution. So there was a huge investment in people's skills. So they were more flexible, higher degrees of literacy, especially primary, secondary education in places like Korea, which equipped workers to be the winners as the economy evolved from agriculture to industry. And so I think those are the kinds of policies which have been tried in other countries as well, that have helped execute the political choice of the level of inequality a society wishes to have. But I just wanted to detach that from growth overall, because there's no correlation. You don't have to be unequal to be rich. It is, at the end of the day, a political decision.
It's a political choice. The question that's going around in my head at the moment is what is the right dose of inequality, assuming that or we agree that it's necessary for a certain amount of economic growth and development. I mean, what you're saying is that there needs to be a political choice to mitigate the effects of inequality. Would that be right?
Yeah, and I think you can see, well, let's take China as an example of a country that has allowed inequality to grow very high on the Gini measure, which was referred to a moment ago, which is a measure of absolute income inequality between, so it's everybody's income in a country. So if one person had all the income, your Gini is 100. If everybody had the same income, your Gini coefficient is the other extreme, is 0. So China's income inequality measured by the Gini coefficient actually stopped rising in 2010. It's plateaued. And so as the country became middle class, closer to upper middle income status, the redistribution part, as in higher spending on the welfare state, more progressive taxation, all of the redistributive policies that we're used to in Europe with the welfare state, they're beginning to develop. And so they are beginning, I think, to make some progress. But I should say there are many countries in the world where, especially in Latin America and South Africa, there are countries with very high levels of income inequality which remain there. So again, I think it's not just a kind of one-off, you do it as you industrialize. I think even as you develop, you need to make those choices constantly heard.
Okay, so Latin America, the US as well.
Let's not pick on the US.
Let's not pick on the US.
Or maybe we should.
But Peter, I'll get to you in just a second, but the question that I'd like to ask you all is, if we have such positive examples, why is it that countries like India, countries in Latin America, the US in recent decades, have chosen not to do that? Mario?
New leaders?
So I call it elite capture, right? Well, me and many more people. But one of the worst problems of inequality is not only the impact it has on growth, which is something, the impact it may have in reducing poverty reduction from economic prosperity. So the worst problem of inequality is elite capture. So it's an economic elite that is also the political elite, or that captures political decisions, right? And what this produces is that every effort that we have in combating this inequality becomes very difficult, obviously, because it's an affront to these elites as well. Yeah, but there are very easy measures. So colleagues of the presenter before, Sukman, has showed very well how we could close tax havens in a year, right? I mean, stop trade with Luxembourg, and tomorrow it won't be a tax haven anymore, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do, and suddenly are not happening, no? And my take is that that's the very negative part of inequality. They're not happening because, not only, but they also affect greatly an elite that does not want these changes.
Peter, why do we have what seems to be a failure of elites in many countries?
I don't want to blame, in general, the elites of different countries. I just want to answer your question about the right dose of inequality. And this depends on the dimension we are talking about. I would say 0 dose of inequality when we are talking about access to education. And we have so many countries where people don't have access to education. This is not tolerable. And I would say 0 dose when talking about access to knowledge. 0 dose when we talk about access to power. So when we are talking about income, I can just talk about my own country. I can't define what should be tolerated or not tolerated. but even as a member of the board of the Employers Association, I would say if there is a manager who really thinks without any kind of entrepreneurial risk he has to bear on his shoulders, he is just selling his workforce, thinks that he gets and should get a 2-digit million income per year, I would say you never would get such a contract signed by me. I think, and we have those managers. So I never would tolerate it. I'm not asking for a legal, now in Germany, for a legal intervention, but I think it's a question of mindset. And this is what I'm trying to sell. I'm not trying to sell a so-called German model. There is no model, no German model which can be copied by others. But we can talk about mindsets. And I am looking to the International Labour Organization. And if you look to the fundamental rights which were defined there you can find a way, a global way to the right mindset. This is what I said. We should try to establish an economic system where economic progress goes parallel with social redistribution. So this is what I think we should argue for. And this is not a German model. This can be realized everywhere in the world. And I'm really fighting for independent trade unions. I think in India you need more independent trade unions than powerful employers. And this I'm saying as a representative of the employers. I think there is a lack of independent counterpowers which can be partners for employers. And this is the mindset. It's not a German model. It's a mindset which comes from ILO conventions, from the thinking within the United Nations, and I think we can do a lot in political terms.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to hold that thought about mindsets, but I just want to have a look. We have a question over here. Where are our microphones? Oh, we have lots of questions. So we're going to start with this gentleman, and I think what we're going to do is collect a few questions. So we're going to start with this gentleman, and then we have 3 ladies over there, and we have 3 people over there. So let's collect the questions.
I'm curious to hear your opinion about the idea of unconditional base income. You know, the system, like everybody should get monthly some base income without any precondition. Could it maybe solve the problem of inequality, or maybe help to solve this? Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Universal basic income. We need a microphone over there, the lady in red. And do give us your name and who you work for, where you come from.
I am Maria Galindo from Bolivia. There are 2 questions. The first one, I ask to redefine poverty, because it is very urgent also that. What are we talking about when we are talking about poverty? And the second question is about women and men. When we talk about poverty, the biggest pack is in the shoulder of women. So poverty and women has a lot to do together, and any policy to change anything should take in consideration women-men relationships.
Okay, thank you. A little bit further down, a couple of ladies had their hands up here. Okay, well, we'll come to you in a second.
My name is Chiman Salah. I'm from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I am a writer, journalist, and author of a book printed recently under the title of The Word in Chaos. My question is, according to those conversations, Can we conclude that another redistribution of the groups of the countries in the world, or the categorization of the countries, can be happen soon in terms of developed, underdeveloped, and or the trash group that, if I am not mistaken, named by this gentleman, Lucas, will be materialized soon? Thank you very much. Anyone can answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, there's a lady over here.
Yeah,
if we could have a microphone. You have one. Sorry.
My question is to Mr. Colin Gonsalves. So you talked about that more than 50 million people are living below the poverty line in India. So we generally define a person as a poor who doesn't have the basic necessities of life. But till now we have seen that there is no concrete list of what constitutes the basic necessities of life. Because poor are there everywhere in the world, be it India or US. So don't you think we should have a universal list of basic necessities of life so that poverty can be tackled in that manner? And the other question is, the money metric approach, which is like till now has been carried on by the World Bank itself, has been under debate. And at the same time, for example, the World Bank considers the income criteria, and in India we have the expenditure criteria. So you can expend by depleting your family assets or by taking loan. But the government doesn't consider this in mind, that even though you're expending that much, there might be certain consideration into it. So can you tell me that can we come to a global platform to come with an international instrument which can define the basic necessities of life so that the political governments can act accordingly?
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got about 4 or 5 questions now, so let's deal with them first, and then we'll see if we still have time for the rest. Let me start with universal basic income. I'll put that to you, Mario. Is that an answer?
One of the possible contributions, right? So this has been studied in several places. We don't have a whole lot of experiences, long-term, like big population. There's one being conducted in Finland right now with unemployed people. But the advantage of such kind of transfer would be, or income, would be that you don't need any efforts in targeting. You don't need a huge mass of civil servants handling your transfer, right? And all the problems of identifying who really needs it and how much. So it's a very promising tool, one of the possible.
Okay. We had a question about the gap between men and women in terms of poverty. I could ask you, but I'm going to ask Peter, how are we going to reduce that gap? And how important is that gap in terms of addressing inequality? The gap between, generally, women are poorer than men. There's a serious inequality there. So how important is it to address that inequality?
I think it is important, and I can't really tell you how it can be addressed in India, how it can be addressed in the United States. In Germany, I have a look to our education system. This is what I am looking always at when I'm thinking about the right social policy to minimize inequalities. And there I see women have the best results, the best education, and in another 10, 15 years' time, we, the male, I will be retired at that time, we will have hard competition by women. And it is forced also by political decisions, and there I am not fully in line with my own organization because I'm not totally against quotas for high-level positions for women.
Okay. Can I ask you, Linda, if I understand correctly, we had a question which is sort of saying, when are we going to get to a point where the distribution of wealth on a global scale will be more equal? You know, when will more poor nations catch up with the rich world?
And I think it's going to be some time yet, but we know the World Bank, for instance, has decided to stop categorizing countries as developed versus developing because of the progress made by developing countries. So they now look at the world in regional groupings. So I think that's one indicator that some of the progress, especially against extreme poverty, has been very impressive. 1 billion people lifted out of abject poverty. Of course, as Mario has mentioned this, and I refer to it as well, that has implications for inequality. But I would also say if you made $1.91 per day, adjusted for what $1 buys in your country, you're still poor. So it's not the end of poverty. So that's why if you wanted to close the gap between the wealth of developed and developing countries, you will have to look beyond measures like these absolute levels to get a sense of how much progress there is. I mean, I think, but we shouldn't overlook how much progress there has been. So on current trends, where we currently sit, the global middle class, those earning between $10 to $100 per day, adjusted for purchasing power parity or what $1 buys in your country, that number has grown significantly since the 1990s, when you've had the adoption of market-oriented reforms in China, outward move from India, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And on current trends, by 2030, and this is a projection by the OECD, more than half of the world's population will be middle class in that definition. So out of 8.6 billion people on the planet, 4.9 billion will be middle income. That's a point that we've never had before. So I think we must remind ourselves there is progress, and then, of course, continue to address the problems of poverty and inequality. And by the way, I found out that if somebody is middle income or middle class, it's an indicator is not if they have a mobile phone, because half the world have mobile phones. It's actually if you can afford a refrigerator. So if you can afford a refrigerator, that means, you can store your food and you don't have to walk long distances. That is actually a marker of those who have entered the middle class. So, we've got issues to deal with, but I think it is worth thinking about some of the progress that has come along through this adoption of market-oriented forces. But as we've been discussing, it comes with its own social challenges around inequality.
Thanks for that, Linda. Colin, I'm going to come to you for a definition of poverty in a second, and the basic necessities of life, which was also a question there. But first of all, I've been ignoring my colleague, Yakov Leon, the whole time, but he has stuff for us. So what do you have, Yakov?
People are rather commenting what they've heard here rather than asking questions, but still a few thoughts we could share. Rich countries are getting richer and poor countries are hardly moving anywhere. Economic inequalities are on the rise, and it seems that only rich, developed countries can do something about it, but they're not. Is there anything what would change their mind? That's, for example, one of the questions. Then, how are China and India catching up when these countries exploit its workers for the markets in Western countries? People in these countries do not earn more or have better health insurance. And here, for example, another thought, as we heard here, a call for drastic political changes to tackle rising global inequalities. Some users have been wondering, what does that mean concretely? What exactly needs to be done or happen?
Okay. Thank you for that, Yakov. Colin, I've been ignoring you for a few minutes. Excuse me for that. We had a question from one of our guests just over there about, how should we be defining poverty, and how should we be defining the basic necessities of life? We have the definition of $1.9 earnings per day as the definition of extreme poverty at the moment. What's your definition?
Well, we've been fighting with the World Bank for a very, very long time, and we see the World Bank as the enemy of the people, because the World Bank has been the principal instrument, and the IMF have been the principal institutions that have fooled the people of the world on poverty. So first it was $1 a day, then it was $2 a day. And can you imagine in 2018, $2 a day is your definition of poverty? Take $4. Can you have $4 a day as a definition? Take $10 in the world of globalization. And India is the leader in globalization. Let's say we take your $2, we make it $6, $8, $10. Can you have $10 a day for an individual in a country as your level of poverty? So what they did was, what the World Bank and the Indian government did, they manipulated figures to show poverty going down. How did they do that? By eliminating the poverty line. By putting it at $2, $1.50, $1, and the Planning Commission would say, hey, over the last 5 years, we've got so many million people escaping poverty. But you just have to look at the definition of the poverty line. That's the first thing, right? So you take a realistic poverty line in India, and you'd come to the amazing figure of 80%, 70% of the population, clearly below a poverty line. You take $2, $3, $4, $5, it goes higher. So you don't manipulate poverty by manipulating the poverty line. You must look really, you must look at the children, you must look at the emaciated bodies. 50% of all children malnourished. 27% of all children severely malnourished. 50% of all women anemic and malnourished. And you have the audacity to say India is coming out of poverty? That's one. Look at redistribution. I hate that term, redistribution. It's almost as if the rich are, distributing things to the poor. It's one of those tinkering magic formulas that people come up with in social discourse. Let's do redistribution. There has been massive redistribution in India. But from the working people to the upper classes. Millions of acres of land have been acquired by the state for mining companies, industrial companies, and so on, in public interest. It's a common feature in the developing country that the state will take your land in public interest much, much lower than market rates and give it to the industrialists. Millions. There's an armed struggle in my country going on in the tribal areas because the tribals say we won't give you our land. And so they pick up arms against the state, and the whole world says that they're Maoists and terrorists. They pick up arms against the state saying we will not give you our land. So redistribution is taking place on a very large scale in the developing world. Look at the forests. Forest areas are being completely dismantled, both in India and elsewhere. It is a transfer of forest lands to cement companies, to all kinds of companies. Waters, the rivers are privatized, because privatization is the great mantra of globalization. It's like a magic mantra. You say the prayer and it happens. You take your rivers, you privatize them, and you give it to companies that use your water. Nuclear plants use their water, cement plants use their water, and put the pollution back in the rivers. So that redistribution term is a term we have come to detest, because there is, in fact, a redistribution. The poorest of the earth are giving the best resources of the earth to the rich and to the middle classes. Why? Because the World Bank identified the middle classes and the upper middle classes as the engine of change. The engine of growth is not the people of India, it's the middle classes. So what did they say? Why do you have education for all? It's a foolish social democratic socialistic idea. Concentrate your education on your middle classes. Let the rest go out, fall out of the education system. Why do you treat people in fancy hospitals? You're wasting your money with scarce resources, spreading them thin. Why do you give subsidies to the poor? Food subsidies. The World Bank tried to close down, until very recently, the entire public distribution system of subsidized grain for the poor. Why? Because it's a waste of scarce natural resources. Give it to the industrialists and they will ultimately lead India to change. So the middle class is identified under globalization by the World Bank and IMF, which I repeat, are the enemies of the people. They identified the middle classes as the engine of change and said, socialism said take everybody along, but we say it's a foolish, idealistic idea. Don't spread your resources too thin. Let them go out of the system. It's quite all right. And so the World Bank thing, the World Bank saying this and the World Bank saying that, let me say, my part of the country, we don't believe in these statistics that poverty is going down. It doesn't make sense to us at all.
Colin, we could go on for many minutes and probably more than minutes. It would be wonderful to go on, but our time, unfortunately, is up. Peter, thank you very much. Mario, many thanks to you. Colin, Linda, a very passionate panel. Thank you very, very much. I'd ask our audience to give them a round of applause. Thank you for your participation. Sorry we didn't get all your questions in, but you can meet these people in person on the boat ride, which is going to be starting very soon. If you don't know where the boat is or where the river, basically the river is that way, and that's where you'll find the boat. And if you need any assistance, just ask the information desk outside. Many thanks. The first day of the GMF is over. Thank you for your presence, for your participation. See you tomorrow. Peter, ja, vielen Dank.